Dr. Sydney Mufamadi, the National Security Special Advisor, has confirmed that the United States informed South Africa's government about the alleged sale of weapons to Russia weeks ago. Before the U.S. envoy's visit, Dr. Mufamadi held a media briefing on his recent journey to the United States. Spector, Associate Editor of the Daily Maverick, and Western Cape Premier Alan Winde. We do not have the Premier, I beg your pardon, but we do have Spector. He joins us now to take a look at the week's events. What a week it was, Brooks. Thank you very much for joining us. So maybe let's start with your position in terms of what you witnessed with this entire debacle with the ambassador to South Africa.
Well, part of the challenge for me is that, like most people, we're still to some degree boxing with shadows. We don't have hard facts at hand. What we do have is the effect of people saying there are facts, and we have the effect of people responding to that. And we have a lot of dancing around the question, and we have what I would call non-denial denials about whether or not weapons were in fact shipped from the Lady R out of Simonstown. And let's not forget that very large cargo plane that landed at Waterkloof Air Force Base not so long ago either. The problem, I guess, in a succinct kind of way, the South African government insisted is neutral in the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and yet by its deeds, acts, and complicit silences appears not to be, and that has quite clearly bristled the Americans. And let me also add, I suspect that most Western European nations are not very happy about this either, even if they haven't said much about it, because they are also deeply engaged in trying to ward off a collapse of the Ukrainian government and its military. So we have all these things happening at the same time. You have Sydney Mufamadi's visit to the U.S. together with a small delegation, trying to convince appropriate people within the United States government structures that no, South Africa is really neutral in the struggle in Ukraine, and yet at the same time, then you have telephone calls between the Russian president and the South African president affirming further, deeper, richer, more full-bodied cooperation. And on top of all that, just to make it even more complicated, there is the hanging question about whether or not Vladimir Putin, president of Russia, will in fact arrive in South Africa for a BRICS leadership summit a few months from now. And he, of course, is under a warrant of arrest from the International Criminal Court because of the way in which Ukrainian children and even infants have been taken away forcibly. That's the charge from the ICC. It wasn't a warrant of arrest for the entirety of the war, but for that specific crime. So this is a terribly complex situation. And then at the end of it, the South African president announced that there would be a commission of inquiry headed by a retired judge. And my problem with that, I guess, is that you don't set up a commission of inquiry if you are firm and fully believing that your government or its agents or its institutions or any of its officials have done nothing wrong. And so we now have this murky business in front of us. Does that summarize enough of what's going on?
Let's unpack that elephant, or chop it up piece by piece, because what informs the assertion or the perception that the South African government, through its deeds, even though it says it is neutral, you say through its deeds is not. What informs that? Because yes, President Cyril Ramaphosa did have a conversation with Vladimir Putin. He also had a conversation with the president of Ukraine, Volodymyr Zelensky. In fact, we're running that report today. And so what informs this perception that South Africa is not neutral?
Well, it was the content of the conversation with Vladimir Putin in which at least the Russians announcing that the conversation had reaffirmed the continued deep and even further cooperative relations between the two countries. That plus the military joint exercise off the coast of KwaZulu-Natal, plus the earlier visit and discussions with Russian officials by the Minister of Defense and Security, and the fact that so far at least the South Africans have not demonstrated in any public sense to the Russians, I beg your pardon, to the Russians that they should cease, that they should withdraw, that they should stop hostilities, which they started. And so those factors inform this view. Obviously, the South African government is not sending military personnel to aid the Russians, but it, by the same token, has voted against resolutions at the UN that would have condemned Russian attacks on Ukraine. So that doesn't lead cumulatively to the idea that the South African government perceptually is neutral in the issue. Now, I would add that the South Africans appear to have been engaged in and supportive of trying to achieve a shipping corridor from Ukrainian ports of grain to the rest of the world, and that was important, and that should be saluted.
Brooks, why is it incumbent on South Africa to tell Russia to stop the war? They didn't tell them to stop the war. It may be a simple question, but why is it incumbent on this country to tell Russia to stop the war?
Well, it's incumbent on South Africa to say that because that's a policy that it has affirmed in many previous statements, that war should not be used, invasion should not be used as a means of settling international disputes. And that runs right back through the years of Nelson Mandela's presidency. And I think it would not have been a difficult position to take, to say an invasion of a sovereign neighbor is not appropriate, and it belies the principles that we support. Now, that would have been an easy moment to do that, and the fact that they have been reluctant to do that each time makes it a little more complex and a little more difficult. Now, the South Africans, by the same token, were not reluctant to condemn various other actions. I don't recall South Africa standing aside on the question of the United States invasion of Iraq. I think that was roundly condemned by the South Africans. So that, and I believe probably should have been, but you don't get to pick and choose your moments of condemning aggression. If you believe that military action is not the way to solve disputes, then you have to accept that as a general principle rather than simply one that you do at your convenience. I guess that'd be my best answer for you.
Yeah, I guess when we speak of you don't get to pick and choose, it could very well be argued that the United States also doesn't get to pick and choose. I mean, if you take a look at what Colin Powell did before the United Nations when it comes to Iraq and various other historical events that changed the course of people's lives over the years, does that argument also not apply for the United States?
Well, I made my point just before that by saying that I think the South African condemnation of the Iraq invasion in 2003 was appropriate. I didn't support it either. But the issue at hand now is the current invasion, right? Because we can always go back through history and point to any number of events by any number of societies, states, and individuals which were quite clearly condemnatory in their nature. But we're dealing now with an invasion in Ukraine, and the South Africans had to make government had to make a choice about whether it would speak out against it or remain effectively silent. And I think that was a decision that's now come back to haunt them a bit.
Daily Maverick Associate Editor Brooks Spector, thank you very much for your time this morning.